A decade of horror, a decade of misery, and a decade of war. The 1940s. A war unlike any other ravaged the world, from the skies of Germany to the serene beaches of Hawaii. It was World War II, and it changed the world. For most Americans, it was a decade of uncertainty. But being Americans, we stood up. We lived. We never gave up. Within our borders, we danced to the beats of Frank Sinatra and watched movies that commemorated the heroic efforts of American soldiers. Although times were hard, we broke barriers of race and gender. We lived to see our soldiers returning with victory in their strides and America in their minds.
"1940s fashion was a mix between glamour and comfort. However, it was also very specific to details. Certain outfits were meant for certain times in the day. In general, men wore what would now be considered formal attire: suits, ties, and hats. Men saw suits with narrow lapels, shorter jackets, and no vests or pant cuffs because of the conservation of material for the war effort. They also wore more sturdy as opposed to flashy clothing, as they didn't want to be criticized for not supporting the war. However, young Mexican Americans wore zoot suits, which used more material than traditional clothing, and were looked down upon as unpatriotic. Women, on the other hand, wore dresses and skirts, but not slacks just yet. As fashion progressed, women saw the development of a few new jackets. The short, fitted jacket, which was cut at the waist and slightly flared out at the bottom, and the bolero, which was a slimmer fit, imitating the Spanish fashion. Also complementing gloves were extremely popular during this decade. Fur was similarly common, along with animal skins. From crocodile purses to lambskin lining, every animal was a part of fashion. Women also showed support for the war effort by wearing red, white, or blue shoes. Overall, clothes in the 1940s, especially women's, were bright and colorful. The brighter, the better.
The 1940s saw the peak of the crooner, which was a name given to jazz singers that sang in a soft, low voice, and were thus usually male. Some of the most popular crooners were Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. Bing Crosby was made one of the most recognizable voices of Christmas when he recorded Irving Berlin's White Christmas, which premiered on a Christmas Day radio broadcast in 1941. The song went on to become the best-selling single of all time, with over 50 million singles sold, and 100 million sales factoring in other artists' covers. On the other hand, jazz was transformed. Musicians such as Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie began experimenting with melodic and harmonic dissonances and started to create new forms of music. Minton's Playhouse became the laboratory for these experiments, and Parker, Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Christian, and Kenny Clarke all regularly played there by 1941. Two styles of music were soon born: Dixieland, which was a nostalgic movement remembering the hot jazz of New Orleans, and bebop, which looked forward and strayed from swing and preceding music. 1940s music also saw the influence of the war on the home front. Patriotic songs urged Americans to remember December 7th or accentuate the positive. Moreover, artists used propaganda to their advantage by mocking America's enemies. One song made fun of the Japanese.
You're a sap, Mr. Jack, to make a Yankee cranky. You're a sap, Mr. Jack, Uncle Sam is gonna spank you.
Lastly, songs such as Nat King Cole's If I Could Be With You reminded millions of soldiers of home. Music, just like all other forms of culture, was strongly impacted by World War II.
Like all the other avenues of culture during the 1940s, movies were also dominated by the war. However, unlike some other industries, the film industry was assisted by the government because of its effectiveness as a form of propaganda. In return, the industry made training videos for the army free of charge. This program was led by Darryl Zanuck. The decade also saw some technological breakthroughs, as evidenced by films such as Citizen Kane, Casablanca, and The Grapes of Wrath. In the beginning of the decade, 1941, the industry was subject to political attacks and had to face problems of increased taxation and labor demands. For example, anti-war advocates pointed to films designed to promote American morale and antagonize the Axis powers, accusing the film industry of warmongering. However, there was still a strong underlying market for war films, although not specifically anti-Nazi films. No anti-Nazi film made the top 10 grossers list, but Sergeant York, the life story of an American World War II hero, was a box office sensation. Despite the seriousness of the war, though, there's a strong demand for comedic movies. Thus, Abbott and Costello became the hot newcomers of 1941, as shown by the success of their first three movies, Buck Privates, Hold That Coast, and Keeping Flying. In contrast, by 1949, the war had ended for a couple of years, but its influence was still strong. Successful movies such as Battleground, Task Force, and The Sands of Iwo Jima also dealt with the war. In addition, even two high-grossing comedies, I Was a Male War Bride and Francis, both had war backgrounds.
As the war raged on in Europe, American sports helped keep those at home unified. Though some people argue that the war and the war alone should be the focus of the United States, many individuals like President Roosevelt supported the playing of sports during wartime. The president wrote the Green Light letter in which he said, "I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. There will be fewer people unemployed and everybody will work for longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means that they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work, even more than before." Baseball dominated the American sports world in the 1940s with open support from the president and thousands of fans. The 40s were filled with a myriad of great moments in the MLB. Joe DiMaggio recorded a hit in 56 consecutive games, setting an MLB record that is still alive today. Cleveland third baseman Ken Keltner ended the run on July 17, 1941. Then, Hall of Famer Hank Greenberg was the first major star to leave for the World War. Greenberg returned to the Detroit Tigers in July 1945. On the season's final day, Detroit needed a win to avoid a pennant playoff game against Washington. Greenberg made sure that did not happen. He hit a grand slam to win the game and the pennant for the Tigers, sending them to the World Series where they would win it in 7 games. Then, in arguably the biggest moment in baseball history, Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball on April 15, 1947. Previously, African Americans were forced to play in the Negro Leagues, leagues that they were designed only for them. Robinson faced intense resentment and racism. In fact, many members of his own team threatened mutiny rather than play with an African American. Opposing players, managers, and some fans would also laud racist remarks and taunts to Robinson. Some even threatened to kill him. On the other hand, many fans and teammates supported Robinson. That year, he won the MLB Rookie of the Year. And 2 years later, in 1949, he won the league's Most Valuable Player award, being the first black player to ever win these honors. Jackie played a key role in the Dodgers' success in the years that followed, leading them to 6 World Series appearances and 1 World Series title in 1955. Baseball was not just a sport for men. Women also played professionally in the 1940s. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was established in 1943 because of the decrease in men's players because of the war. Team names such as the Milwaukee Chicks, the Fort Wayne Daisies, and the Rockford Peaches revealed the biases of the league's owners. Players were also required to embody to what Wrigley designated as the highest ideals of womanhood. The league nonetheless produced a number of excellent baseball players, including first baseman Dorothy Kamenchek, second baseman Sophie Kures, and pitcher Gene Fout. The league was closed in 1954.
1940s toys were beginning to become more sophisticated than those manufactured a decade ago. However, they also had a military touch to them. Almost all boys played with toy guns and military-type weapons. Similarly, girls were learning to become more mature as well, with toys for all the objects that their moms had. There were toy brooms, mops, tea sets, iron, ovens, and more. If a mom had it, they made a smaller version for the daughter. As technology advanced in other industries, it had its effects on the toy industry as well. Toys began to call themselves electronic, though this term could mean simply that the toy had a blinking light. Board game makers were all after the next monopoly.
The closest match was Chutes and Ladders, modeled after India's Snakes and Ladders, which was introduced in 1943 by Milton Bradley. Also, supernatural board games began to make their way up the market, and spinning fortune tellers began making their way into households across the nation.